The bell above the door of Hargrove's Feed and Seed rang twice before anyone looked up. Eldon Rourke set a leather satchel on the counter, heavy enough that it made a dull sound against the wood. He didn't speak. He simply unbuckled it and began counting bills, one after another, until the stack sat squarely in front of the clerk. Otis Hargrove looked at the money, then at the order slip in his other hand, then back at the money. 800, he said, more to himself than to Eldon. Cottonwood and willow, mostly. That's near every seedling I can lay hands on before the ground turns. Eldon nodded once. That's a great deal of digging for one man, Mr. Rourke, even with hands to help you. I know it. Otis waited for more. None came. He had known Eldon Rourke for 11 years, had sold him plow blades and seed corn, and once a good bay mare, and in all that time the man had never spoken more than he needed to. This morning was no different, except for the money on the counter, and the number written on the slip, and the way Eldon's hand had not once shaken while he counted it. Outside, two boys loaded bundle after bundle onto the bed of the wagon, each one wrapped tight in burlap and roped down before the next was carried out. A small knot of townsfolk had gathered near the boardwalk by the third trip, watching without quite meaning to. That's an awful lot of trees for one man, someone murmured. That's the Rourke place, another answered, quieter. You heard what happened out there. The creek, back in the spring. Nobody said anything more after that. In Brennan's Ford, people had learned to let a silence sit when it needed to. Eldon tied off the last rope himself, checked it twice, and climbed onto the bench seat without looking back at the store, or the townsfolk, or the wagon groaning under its new weight. The reins sat loose in his hands. He clicked his tongue once, and the horses pulled the load out past the edge of town, dust rising slow behind the wheels. What the people of Brennan's Ford knew was only this. 3 months earlier, the Rourke family had been caught on the road home from a visit to kin, and the creek, the same creek that ran gentle and shallow most of the year, had taken all of it in the space of an afternoon. What none of them knew, watching that wagon disappear past the last fence line, was what those 800 trees were for, or that this was only the beginning of a great deal more. 3 months earlier. Late March had come warm that year, warmer than anyone in the valley could recall, and the snow on the high ridges had gone soft and gray and restless weeks before it should have. Eldon Rourke didn't think much of it on the morning he hitched the wagon. Adeline had packed a basket of preserves for her cousin's family 2 valleys over, the kind of visit they made once a year when the roads allowed it, and Micah had been awake before either of them, already dressed, already asking how long the ride would take. "Half a day there," Eldon told him. "Half a day back, if the weather holds. And if it doesn't, then we'll see." Micah was 7 that spring, quiet in the way some boys are quiet, not shy, just watchful. The kind of child who noticed things and kept them to himself until he decided they were worth saying out loud. He sat between his parents on the bench seat most of the ride, and for a long while he said nothing at all, just watched the country go by. The low hills still brown from winter, the creek running high and fast alongside the road. It was at his cousin's place, 2 days into the visit, that he finally said it. The Hollis farm sat lower in the valley, sheltered by a long stand of cottonwood that someone 2 generations back had planted along the fence line. And by an afternoon in late March, the trees already had a haze of green at the tips, and the yard beneath them stayed cool even when the sun climbed high. There was a pond behind the barn, spring-fed, deep enough that the Hollis children swam in it come summer. Micah stood at the edge of it that last evening, watching the water go still and gold in the low light, and when his father came to stand beside him, he didn't look up. "Cousin Ruth says the shade keeps their whole yard cool clear through August," Micah said. "Our place doesn't have that." "Not yet. Ours is just fence posts, wind mostly." Eldon didn't answer right away. He was watching the light on the water, same as his son. "If we had trees like this," Micah said, "I bet summer wouldn't feel so long. Maybe someday. I wish I could fish somewhere like this. At home, I mean. Just sit right there with a line in the water and not have to go anywhere for it. Eldon put a hand on the boy's shoulder, the kind of gesture that didn't need words behind it, and for a while they stood there together and watched the pond hold the last of the light before it faded. They left the following morning. The trouble started with the sound. Eldon noticed it first, a low rushing that hadn't been there on the ride out, carrying up from somewhere below the road before the creek itself came into view. He slowed the horses without quite knowing why. Adeline noticed it next, the way her hand found the edge of the bench seat and gripped it. "That water wasn't running like that 2 days ago," she said. It hadn't been. 2 days before, the creek had been low and easy, the kind of crossing a wagon took without a second thought. Now, rounding the last bend before the ford, Eldon saw it for what it had become. A wide, brown surge, fast and heavy, carrying branches and torn sod along its surface, already lapping at the edges of the crossing stones. He should have turned back then. He would carry that thought for the rest of his life, turn it over so many times it wore smooth, like a river stone. He should have turned back the moment he heard the water. But the crossing had always held. He had taken this road 100 times, and the ford had always held. And the far bank was close, and the sky above the ridge was already darkening with something that hadn't been there an hour before, and turning back meant another night on the road. And Adeline had said she wanted to be home before... He never finished the thought. Later, he would understand that the storm they saw building over the ridge was not the storm that killed his family. That one had already spent itself somewhere high in the mountains hours before, and its water was only now finding its way down through every gully and draw into the one creek that stood between the Rourke wagon and home. The wheels caught halfway across. It happened faster than Eldon could describe to anyone afterward, faster than his mind could hold on to in any order that made sense. The wagon tipped. The horses screamed and fought their harness. Adeline's hand was in his for one moment, and Micah's voice called out for him once, high and sharp over the roar of the water, and then the current took the whole world sideways. Eldon woke on the bank a quarter-mile downstream, his ribs cracked, his mouth full of silt, with no memory of how he had gotten there. He searched until the light failed. He searched again at first light, and through the day after, and men from Brennan's ford came out with ropes and lanterns and searched alongside him for 3 more days after that. They found Adeline 11 miles downstream, caught in a logjam where the creek widened into the river. They never found Micah. For the first month, Eldon didn't go near the barn. He sat most days in the house that had gone too quiet, at a table set for 3 that he never once thought to reset for 1, and let the neighbors bring what food they brought, and answer the door when it needed answering, and otherwise did nothing at all. Ansel Marrow, who had worked the Rourke place for going on 6 years by then, kept the herd fed and the fences mended without being asked, and never once came to the house to say so. It was Ansel who found the boots. He hadn't meant to. He'd gone into the mudroom off the kitchen looking for a coil of wire he remembered leaving there, and there they were. Small and scuffed at the toe, set neatly by the door exactly where a boy might leave them after coming in from the yard. Ansel stood there a long moment. Then he set them back precisely as he'd found them, angled the same way, and said nothing to Eldon about it. Not that day, or any day after. Eldon found them himself a week later. He picked them up, turned them over once in his hands, and set them back down in the exact same spot. He did not put them away. He did not know then that he wouldn't put them away for years. The turn came on an evening in early May, 6 weeks after the flood, when Eldon rode out alone to the low ridge above the house, the same ridge Micah used to climb for no reason but to see how far he could see, and sat there until the light went out of the sky. He didn't know why he'd come. He only knew that somewhere in the stillness of it, a memory surfaced that he hadn't let himself touch since the funeral. Micah at the edge of the Hollis pond, the water gold in the low light, saying, "I bet summer wouldn't feel so long." Eldon sat with that a long while. He rode back to the house past midnight, And the next morning, before Ansel had even finished the milking, Eldon was standing in the yard with a shovel in his hand and no clear notion yet of where to put it. The decision, when he finally spoke it aloud, did not sound like a plan. It sounded, to Ansel, like a man talking half to himself. "I'm done hiring hands to work this place," Eldon said. He was looking out at the fence line as he said it, not at Ansel. "I've got more land than I can farm and more land than I need. I mean to lease out what I'm not using, the north sections, the low pasture, whatever families want to start on their own crop. Fair terms. They keep what they grow, pay me a share." Ansel waited. He had learned these past weeks that Eldon's silences usually held more than his words did. "And the rest of it?" Ansel finally asked. "The rest of it, I mean to plant." "Plant what, exactly?" Eldon didn't answer that directly. He crouched down, picked up a handful of dry soil from the yard, and let it run out between his fingers before he spoke again. "Trees," he said. "More than this place has ever seen." Along every fence line, the wind hits hardest. Around the house, along the creek bank where the water won't take them. That's years of growing before any of it does a lick of good. "I know it. Could be more years than either of us has got left in our backs." Eldon stood, brushed the dirt from his hand, and looked at Ansel directly for the first time in the conversation. "I don't need it to do good for me," he said. Ansel didn't ask what he meant by that. He didn't need to. Word of it moved through Brennan's Ford the way word moved through any small town, quickly and mostly without anyone meaning harm by it. "Heard Rourke's giving up half his land to strangers," one man said outside the church one Sunday, "and spending what's left on saplings, of all things. Can't blame him for wanting the company, I suppose. House like that, empty as his is now. It isn't company he wants. It's something to do with his hands that doesn't leave him time to think." Nobody said it unkindly. Nobody laughed. In a town small enough that everyone had stood at the Rourke burial and watched a man bury an empty grave beside his wife's, there wasn't much appetite left for mockery. What passed between the townsfolk instead was something quieter and, in its way, harder to sit under, a kind of careful pity. The sort people extend to a man they've privately decided has come a little unmoored and don't quite know how to reach. Eldon heard some of it. He let it pass through him the way he'd learned to let most things pass through him that spring, without much purchase. Ansel heard more of it than Eldon did, and said nothing about any of it to him. Not the pity, not the doubt, not the quiet bets some of the men placed on how long it would last. He simply kept showing up at the Rourke place 6 days a week, the same as always. Even after his wages changed from a hand's pay to a lease on 40 acres of the north section. Even after half the county had decided there were easier places to earn a living than working alongside a man they'd stopped fully understanding. By the time the first wagon-load of saplings came up the road from Hargrove's that August, Ansel Merrow was the only man in the valley who hadn't asked Eldon Rourke a single question about why. The first plantings went in wrong, and it took Eldon the better part of 2 seasons to understand why. He had set the earliest rows without much thought to the wind, planted where the ground was softest to break, rather than where the gusts came hardest off the western ridge. And by the second winter, half of what he'd put in the ground that first year had either snapped at the trunk or simply dried out standing, having done nothing to slow the wind at all. It was Ansel who finally said something, standing beside him at the fence line on a raw morning in the spring of 1874, watching a stand of 2-year cottonwood bend nearly flat under a gust that came unbroken all the way from the ridge. "You're planting where it's easy to dig," Ansel said, "not where the wind's coming from." Eldon looked at him. "Ground doesn't care which way's easy," Ansel went on. "You want a break, you set your rows crosswise to the wind, not crosswise to the fence." Eldon said nothing for a long moment. Then he picked up the shovel again. They pulled up what had survived and started over, this time laying the rows to face the prevailing wind head-on, the way Ansel had seen done on a place he'd worked before the Rourke land, up near the Canadian line. It was slower work, It meant digging in ground that fought back, ground that hadn't been broken before, root-bound and full of stone. But by the following spring, the difference showed. The young trees stood where they were put, and what wind came through weaker for having passed them first. There were other lessons that cost less, but still cost something. Deer took the tops off a dozen saplings before Eldon understood he'd need more than hope to keep them alive that first winter. And after that, he and Ansel spent a slow, cold week building low wooden cages around every young tree close enough to the tree line that a deer might reach it, and a fence, post and rail, around the plantings nearest the pasture where the cattle grazed. The water was its own puzzle. The spring that fed down off the ridge ran steady enough, but it ran where it ran. And getting it to the rows meant Eldon and Ansel spending the better part of a summer cutting shallow ditches by hand, angled just enough to carry water without carrying away the soil with it, checking each one after every rain to see where it had washed out and needed rebuilding. Man could spend his whole life just fixing ditches, Ansel said once, straightening up from one with his hands raw. Might, Eldon said. Wouldn't be the worst life. By 1875, Ansel had married a quiet, capable woman named Sarah, whose family had come out from Ohio the year before, and moved into a small house he'd built himself on the 40 acres he leased from Eldon. The following spring, their son was born. They named him Tobias. Eldon came to see the boy once, a week after, standing awkward in the doorway with a jar of Adeline's old preserves he'd found still sealed in the cellar and hadn't known what else to do with. He didn't stay long. He said the boy looked strong, shook Ansel's hand, and left before anyone could ask him to hold him. Nobody remarked on it. It was, by then, simply understood between the two families that there were places Eldon didn't go and things Eldon didn't do, and that this was not unkindness, but something else that didn't yet have a name. The trees, at least, were finding their footing. By the summer of 1876, the first rows planted along the western fence had grown tall enough to cast a real line of shade by mid-afternoon, and the wind that reached the yard came through gentler than it had in Eldon's whole memory of the place. Word of it reached even those who'd once wagered on how long the whole venture would last. A few of the tenant families working the leased sections began asking, carefully, whether they might plant a few rows of their own along their allotments, and Eldon said yes before they'd finished asking. It was around this time that Ansel began coming back from trips to town, and later from longer trips east to visit Sarah's people, with small burlap-wrapped bundles he'd hand to Eldon without much ceremony. A few apple seedlings from a nursery he'd passed, a hardy plum variety a stranger on the road had sworn by, a handful of ash saplings traded for a day's labor. Eldon planted every one of them. He kept no separate record of which had come from Ansel and which he'd bought outright, but if anyone had asked him, he could have named every tree on the place that had arrived that way. The willows were the pride of it, for a while. Eldon had set the heaviest planting of them along the spring-fed creek that cut through the eastern edge of the property, reasoning that nothing would take to the wet ground better. And for 3 years, they proved him right. Fast-growing, thick at the base, already 30 feet tall by the summer of 1877, and thickening the bank against erosion the way he'd hoped they might. He found the first sign of trouble on a morning in late August, walking the creek line with Ansel to check the ditches after a week of rain. A stand of a dozen young willows lay flat along the bank, their trunks gnawed clean through, at an angle Eldon didn't recognize. The wood pale and fresh where the teeth had worked. "Beaver," Ansel said, crouching to look closer. "Been at it a while by the look of the pile downstream." They found the lodge 2 bends down, built up out of branches Eldon recognized, his own willows, dragged and stacked and packed with mud. By the time they'd walked the full length of the planting that afternoon, they counted better than 60 trees down, some of them the oldest and thickest on the whole property, gone in what could not have been more than a handful of nights. Eldon didn't say much that day. He said less over the following week as he and Ansel worked to wire cages around what remained and dragged the felled trunks clear of the water. And by the second week of September, standing at the edge of the ravaged bank with the last of the ruined willows stacked for burning, something in him that had been holding steady for 6 years finally gave way. "Maybe I ought to stop," he said. He wasn't looking at Ansel when he said it. He was looking at the stumps. Ansel didn't answer right away. He picked up his axe and went back to clearing brush from the next section of bank, the way he had every morning that week, the way he had every morning for 6 years. Eldon stood there a while longer. Then, because there was nothing else to do with his hands, he picked up the saw and went back to work beside him. Neither of them spoke of it again. But 3 days later, when Ansel arrived before dawn to start the morning's clearing, he found Eldon already at the creek, marking out a new line for cages 10 yards back from the water, where no beaver could reach and no flood could easily take what they'd planted there. They lost part of that planting a second time that winter, an early hard freeze catching a row of young ash before they'd had time to harden off, splitting a dozen trunks clean through. Eldon looked it over once in the spring thaw, said nothing more than, "We'll set 'em further from the draw next time," and did. By 1879, the willows had come back thicker along the new line, the ash stood where the ash belonged, and the cottonwood windbreak along the western fence had grown tall enough that, for the first time since he'd started, Eldon Rourke stood in his own yard on a July afternoon and felt the wind pass over him instead of through him. By the summer of 1879, Eldon stood at the edge of his own land and saw, for the first time, what 8 years of scattered planting had begun to add up to. The western windbreak ran unbroken for the better part of a mile. The willows along the creek had grown back thick enough to hide the old scars where the beaver had taken them. Even the tenant sections carried their own young rows now, planted by families who'd once only watched Eldon's work from a careful distance. It was Ansel who first said the word aloud. "Ground behind that windbreak doesn't dry out like it used to," he said, kneeling to press a hand into the soil near the western fence. "Held the dam from that last rain 3 days longer than the open pasture did." Eldon crouched down beside him and did the same. "Cooler back here, too," Eldon said. "Wind's not pulling the moisture off it the way it used to." Neither man said anything more that day, but it was the beginning of an idea that had sat unspoken in Eldon since the very start, that a pond dug into open, wind-scoured ground would lose half its water to the sky before it ever did anyone any good, and a pond dug into ground the trees had already learned to shelter might hold. They broke ground on the first basin that September, in a low hollow behind the windbreak where the spring line ran close enough to the surface to feed it. It was slower work than the trees had ever been, weeks of digging by hand and horse-drawn scoop, hauling stone to shore up the banks, cutting a shallow feeder channel down from the spring itself. But by the following spring, the hollow held water clear through the driest weeks of July, in a summer that had left every open stock tank in the valley cracked and dry at the bottom. Tobias Merrill was 3 years old that first summer of digging, and he spent most of it underfoot. He was nothing like the quiet, watchful child Eldon still carried in memory. Toby talked from the moment he woke until the moment he was made to stop, asked the name of every tool within reach twice over, and had, by the time he was 5, developed a habit of giving names to pieces of the land that had never before needed naming. The low crossing near the willows he called Frog Rock, for reasons he explained at great length and Eldon never fully followed, and a bend in the ditch line he insisted on calling the Turning Place. For the first 2 years, Eldon kept a careful distance. He answered the boy's questions when they were put to him directly, showed him where not to put his hands near the horse cages, and otherwise let Sarah or Ansel manage the business of keeping a small, curious child out from underfoot. It was not unkindness. It was, if anything, closer to the opposite. A wariness Eldon couldn't have explained even to himself, a sense that there was something dangerous in letting himself watch this particular child too closely. The boy noticed the distance in his own way, though he never seemed troubled by it. He simply kept showing up anyway. It was the fishing rod that changed something, though not all at once. Toby found it on a rainy afternoon in the spring of 1881, rummaging through the tool shed while Ansel and Eldon worked nearby on a broken harness. It had hung on the same nail for a decade, the line long gone brittle, the reel stiff with disuse. "What's this one for?" Toby asked, holding it up. He was 5, and asked the same question about nearly everything he touched. Eldon looked over. For a moment, he didn't answer at all. "Fishing," he said finally. "There's no fish in the ditch." "No." Toby turned the rod over once in his hands, decided it wasn't as interesting as the harness buckle he'd been examining a moment before, and set it back against the wall, exactly where he'd found it. He didn't ask anything further. He'd already moved on to the next question, something about why horses didn't like the rain, and Eldon answered that one too, more easily than he'd expected to. He didn't say why the rod hung where it hung. He didn't say who it had belonged to. But that evening, walking back to the house alone, Eldon found himself thinking not of the ache the question had opened, but of how plainly the boy had asked it, and how plainly he'd let it go once the answers stopped interesting him. There was no weight in it for Toby. There didn't need to be. It was, Eldon would understand only much later, the first time in 10 years that a question about that part of his life hadn't cost him something to answer. The change, once it came slowly enough that no one, not Eldon, not Ansel, not Sarah, watching from her own porch some evenings, could have named the exact day of it. By 1882, Eldon had taken to letting Toby ride along on the wagon when he checked the young plantings, mostly because the boy asked so persistently that refusing took more effort than allowing it. By 1883, he was teaching him, without much comment on either side, how to tell a healthy root ball from one that had dried out in transport, how deep to set a cottonwood switch, which way to angle a willow cutting so it would take. "Why do you plant them crooked like that?" Toby asked once, watching Eldon set a willow at a slant into the soft ground near the second pond. "Not crooked. Angled toward the water table. Roots will find the damp faster that way."
"How do you know that?"
"Man taught me, long time back." He didn't say who. Toby, characteristically, didn't ask. By the spring of 1884, when the second basin was dug and filling behind a stand of 8-year willow, Eldon brought the boy, 8 years old now, and no quieter than he'd ever been, down to stand at the edge of it. "Needs a name," Eldon said. "Same as the others you've gone and named without asking me." Toby considered this with unusual gravity for a boy who rarely paused before speaking. "Heron Pond," he said finally. "There's one that stands in the shallows most mornings. Same one, I think." Heron Pond, then. It was, in the end, no single moment that undid 10 years of careful distance. It was 100 small ones. A question asked and answered without cost. A name given to a place that hadn't had one. A boy who climbed up onto the wagon seat beside him without waiting to be invited, and simply stayed there, year after year, until Eldon could no longer quite remember when he had stopped bracing against it. Eldon made the trip to Hargrove's alone on a morning in early August 1886, with a satchel heavier than the one he'd carried in 11 years before. 1,200, Otis said, reading the order slip a second time, the way he had the first time, all those years ago. He was older now, gray at the temples, but the disbelief in his voice hadn't changed much. "That's more than your whole first order, Mr. Rourke, by a fair margin." "I know it." "Mind if I ask what for? Whole county knows your place by now. Trees thick as any I've seen this side of the mountains. Didn't figure you had much ground left wanting." Eldon considered the question longer than he usually considered questions from Otis. "Not for my ground," he said finally. "For the Hollisters section and the Petrie place, and the 2 families that took on the east pasture last spring. They've watched what the windbreak's done for my acres long enough. time they had the same, and time enough left in their lives to see it grown. Otis didn't say anything to that for a moment. Then he nodded, the way a man nods when something has just been explained to him that he suspects he won't fully understand until much later. 1,200 trees for other men's land, he said. Never known a rancher who'd spend that kind of money on ground that wasn't his. It's for them, Eldon said. Their land? Their families. He said nothing further. He paid, and the boys loaded the wagon, and word moved through Brennan's Ford by supper time the same way it always had. Not as mockery this time. Hadn't been mockery in years. But something closer to a story people had started telling with a kind of quiet pride, the way a town tells a story about one of its own. Toby rode into town with him that day, 10 years old now and taller than Eldon liked to notice, and the two of them started the ride home in the early afternoon with the wagon loaded heavy and the sky to the west going the color of a bruise. Eldon noticed the color first. He'd learned over 15 years to notice it before anyone else on the road did. The particular gray-green a sky took on above the high ridges when a storm was building fast and would not announce itself gently. "We ought to push on quicker," he said, and something in his voice made Toby stop mid-sentence and simply nod. They were 4 miles from the house, on the stretch of road that ran alongside Miller's Creek. The same creek, Eldon knew, though few in the valley still called it what he privately called it, when the sound reached him. Low, at first, a rushing that hadn't been there 20 minutes before. He pulled the horses up short before the ford and sat a moment, listening. Toby looked at him, then at the water, then back at him. He didn't ask what was wrong. Something in his father's stillness, Ansel's stillness, though the boy had never once called Eldon anything but Mr. Rourke, had already told him this was not a moment for questions. The creek was rising. Not yet at flood, not yet the brown, churning surge Eldon carried in memory, but rising with a speed that told him everything he needed to know about what was happening somewhere up in the high country, out of sight, where a storm had likely already spent itself over ground still baked hard from a dry July. 15 years ago, he had looked at water rising like this and told himself the crossing would hold, because it always had. He did not tell himself that now. "We're not crossing here," he said, and turned the wagon before Toby had time to ask why. He drove them a half-mile back up the road to where a cart track cut off toward higher ground, a longer way home, one that added the better part of an hour to the trip, but one that kept them well above the creek the whole distance. When the track grew too rough for the wagon's full weight, he stopped, unhitched the horses from the load, and set Toby up on the lead horse himself. "What about the trees?" Toby asked, looking back at the wagon, loaded with everything Eldon had just spent a fortune and a morning securing. "Trees can sit in the rain at night. You can't." They rode the rest of the way at a pace that felt, to Toby, unbearably slow, though it was in truth as fast as the ground and the failing light allowed. Rain began somewhere in the last mile, first a scattering, then a hard, steady sheet of it. And Eldon kept the boy close against him the whole way, one arm braced around him, not because there was any longer a crossing to fear, but because there was nothing else useful left for his hands to do. They reached the house well after dark, soaked through, the horses blowing hard, and Sarah was already on the porch with a lantern when they came into the yard, having watched the storm building for the better part of an hour with a fear she didn't bother hiding. Nobody spoke much that night. Ansel took the horses. Sarah wrapped Toby in a blanket by the fire and didn't let go of him for a good while. Eldon stood in the doorway a moment before he came fully inside, looking back out at the rain, at the dark shape of the young orchard beyond the yard bending and holding under the wind, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a word for. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but the particular quiet of a man who has stood in the same fear twice and, the second time, had known enough to bend around it instead of driving straight through. The wagon and its load survived the night well enough, the trees soaked but not lost, and it took 2 more days of hauling before every bundle had found its way to the sections Eldon had promised them to. It was the following week, once the ground had dried enough for walking, that Toby found him standing at the far edge of the eastern planting, near a small cluster of gray, leafless stumps that had stood untouched for years among the healthy rows around them. "Why haven't you ever taken these out?" Toby asked, nudging one with the toe of his boot. "Everything else here's alive. These have been dead as long as I've known this place." Eldon looked at the stumps a long moment. "Leave it be," he said. "Why? Seems like it'd make room for something that'd actually grow." "It's not hurting anything where it stands." Toby considered this, the way he considered most things, briefly and without much need to understand it fully before moving on. He shrugged and turned his attention instead to the pond beyond the trees, where a heron stood motionless in the shallows, same as it had most mornings for 2 years running. "You reckon Heron Pond's got enough water to hold through August this year?" he asked. "Reckon it does." "Pa says next year we ought to dig a third one, past the ridgeline. Says there's a low spot out there that'd hold if we ran a channel down from the spring." "Your pa's usually right about ground." "I think he's right about this one, too. I already walked it twice." "I could show you where." Eldon looked at the boy a moment, sunburned, talking faster than he was thinking, already halfway to some new idea before he'd finished the last one, and something came up in him that he hadn't felt in so long he barely recognized the shape of it. It arrived without warning, the way real laughter always had, before the flood, before any of it, and it came out of him now, low and unguarded, at nothing in particular except the boy standing in front of him talking about water, the way another boy once had. Toby grinned, pleased with himself, without quite knowing why, and kept talking. From the fence line, Ansel watched the two of them a moment longer than the moment required, said nothing, and went back to mending the rail he'd been working on.